I took the night job at a remote fire tower in Colorado because the math at the kitchen table broke down into too many questions and not enough answers. Claire's hands were raw from a double shift at the clinic. Ethan needed braces. Bills kept arriving like cold weather forecasts. The job listing was short: overnight lookout, maintain observation log, report fires. The tower was farther than the gas gauge set, perched on a ridge where the road turned into nothing and the map turned into contour lines. It paid enough to stop the immediate drowning, and that's the honest way to say why I left them for the trees. The tower was a tooth in the ridge, a metal ladder, a wooden cabin up top with battered glass on all sides, and a view that felt like walking inside a postcard. In daylight, the world there was simple and honest. Ridgelines folded into ridgelines, the river a silver thread far below, sun on stone. I told myself I'd be home on weekends, that this was temporary. The climb up the ladder at first light became a ritual: boots on metal rungs, breath fogging, the cabin's single room waiting like a small promise. Cedar was the first person who told me the job came with rules. He lived about a mile down the switchback in a cabin that looked like it had grown up around itself. He had lived on that ridge longer than anyone could pin down. He showed up the second day I was there, a silhouette leaning on a walking stick, clothing that smelled of cedar smoke and old leather. "You'll have to keep the ledger," he said when I offered him the thermos of coffee. His voice was low, like river rock rubbing. "And you'll have to mind the hours." I asked about the shouts people muttered at the post office, the rumors the locals traded like currency. People told me about missing hikers, about weird things seen from the road at dusk, about the way the light goes wrong on certain nights. They said it like it was gossip, something you repeat because the human mouth wants to fill quiet with stories. Cedar didn't talk gossip. He looked at the tower as if he were remembering being there as a boy. "There are rules," he said finally, as if naming the thing would make it stop. 7 of them, as I heard. Old telling. They keep a man clearer. But you ought to know the part that matters most. He paused, and the land around us seemed to listen. "The rules only apply after sunset." It's the kind of line that lodges in your ear and stays. It should be dramatic, but Seer said it like he was noting the weather. "Only after sunset," he repeated, tapping the side of his mouth like he was tapping a calendar. "Daytime's safe enough. At night, the world flips its pockets." I laughed because it was easier than admitting I was unsettled. "Is that literal? Like magic rules?" I asked. "Doesn't matter if you call it magic," he said. "You mind them and you last. You don't and, well..."
He left the rest unsaid, but the air around his words carried what unsaid meant. Empty campsites and cold boots left on porches. He handed me a small scrap of paper folded into quarters. A neighbor left it on my porch 10 years ago. He didn't make it past the second winter. The scrap was weathered. Ink had blurred at the edges like the writing had sweated. A single line: "Do not stray at dusk." I took it and put it in my pocket, more to be polite than because I believed. That night, after I made the loop of the ridgeline and wrote in the ledger, I called Claire on the walkie-talkie they'd given me when Hannah from dispatch taught me how to log reports. Her voice came over steady and small. Ethan's noise in the background, one of those high, happy sounds kids make when sleep has been postponed, pulled on something inside me that guilt could name. I told her it was quiet. She said she'd saved dinner and the clinic had let her go early if I wanted to come down. I told her I'd be up through the night, watching, that it was only until things settled and the season cooled. I told myself the same thing. Temporary. The first week, I treated the place like a museum piece. I swept the floor, lined the pots of instant coffee in the cabinet, studied the lenses of the binoculars until my eyes watered. The daytime was a litany of small tasks and great distances. I learned the weather like a new language, how the updraft puffs smelled like wet rock, how the wind through the open panes made the curtains move in a slow, patient rhythm. I set the lantern near the door so it would be easy to find when the long night came. Daylight keeps everything formal, like walking into a courthouse where the clerk's making change. There were signs that bothered me but didn't immediately alarm. Deer that stood and watched me from weird angles, heads cocked as if they'd seen a misplaced piece of the world. A fox that circled the tower at midday and left a line of little paw prints that ran to the edge of the clearing and stopped as if the fox had come to the end of something. Once, at dusk, I saw a thin smoke far over the ridgeline where there was no road. It glowed like a match trying to decide if it would light. The notes began as small things. A napkin folded under my porch step, a scrap of cloth tied to a branch outside the glass, a pebble placed in the center of the threshold like a punctuation mark. The first full note I found had been tucked under the doormat. It was damp with the morning's condensation and smelled faintly of wood smoke. The handwriting was cramped and hurried, like someone had to get the words down before the night swallowed them. "Do not stray at dusk," it read. "Do not show your terror." I promised myself then that I would not get pulled into superstition. In the refuge of the day, I could tell the world stories that let me sleep, that some hiker tossed the napkin, that an odd wind carried the pebble. But the notes were not jokes.
They fit too perfectly into the places where the tower's architecture made sense. At the threshold of the door, under the sill, folded into the crack of the floorboard where my books scraped when I climbed into bed. At the center of the cabin, under a loose floorboard I only found because the hammer I used for a loose shingle slid and hit metal with a particular sound, I found a smaller box. It was rotted at one corner, but inside were scraps of paper and a thin journal with a brittle leather cover. The journal had been written in a hand that alternated between careful lists and frantic, collapsing loops. It smelled of old smoke and sweat. Whoever had kept it had cataloged nights and the small ways they kept from thinking about the thing outside. Page after page, the author wrote in short commands and longer paragraphs of what not to do, what to prepare. One entry stuck like a thorn. When they come, don't let them see your hands shake. Let the light be an arm, not a warning. Do not show your terror. The notebook did what notebooks are supposed to do. It made memory a tractable thing. The rules in it were half practical: keep the lantern filled, lock the door, and half bone-deep superstition. Do not eat the food they leave. Do not accept gifts with your mouth. Never sleep with the door open. A line in the middle of the book read, "The rules only apply after sunset." Another note had 3 short lines under it, in a crushed pen stroke. "If you must speak, speak flat. No pleading, no begging." I felt ridiculous and strangely grateful as I read. Gratitude because instructions are a kind of ally in frightening places. Ridiculous because the rational part of me, educated, practical, quick to call things by their proper names, knew the rules were folklore, that a scared man will invent instructions because a list keeps chaos from gnawing at the edges. But lists also teach habits. They make men remember to check the bolts and to stack wood. On the 4th night, I found the altar. It was out in the clearing below the tower, off the switchback trail. I had gone down to clear branches that scratched at the lyre, thinking like a person who believes in maintenance, not superstition, that there are practical reasons to tidy the approach. The clearing looked ordinary at first, a ring of stones, tamped earth where people had sat. In the center, a shallow pit, stained black, with ash the color of old bones. Pins and little things stuck into the surrounding dirt, buttons, a single child's shoe with the leather turned inward as if to hide, coins with one side ground smooth. I felt my skin tense in a way I hadn't previously felt up there. Not fear, something like a memory that hurt. The jaw of my hand tightened on the flashlight. The light on the tower had been steady when I left. I told myself I would flip the sack of garbage into the pit and walk back up. The wind wasn't even high. The trees were patient. A smear of something white appeared half buried among the stones. A scrap of paper, a sentence written across it in the same cramped hand. "The watchers do not like it when you look away." There's a peculiar hush that settles over you in places like that. The air is the same as before, but your breathing starts to sound wrong to your own ears, like someone has tuned the world 1 degree off. I turned on the flashlight and the bulb made the clearing into a stage. Shadows lay long and lean, leaning against the trunks like men waiting for a cue. The first real thing that didn't fit my tidy explanations was the way the animals behaved that evening. A small flock of ravens had come down and perched on the outermost branches. They were not scavengers in the way that makes sense. No sudden cawing, no sudden flight. They simply sat and watched me. Not with the hungry glance of predators, but with something deliberately attentive, like neighbors listening at a wall. The deer appeared at the tree line and watched too. They didn't flee when I moved, which is what deer do. They stared, and their eyes seemed glossy and reflective, catching the beam of my flashlight like tiny mirrors. I told myself that logic could hold. Animals can be trained by unnatural patterns. Maybe someone fed them. Maybe there was a carcass somewhere. But then I saw the light on the distant ridge. A tiny orange pinprick at first, like a match. Then another, then a third. They spaced across the valley in a ragged line, the way campfires are sometimes strung out by groups who don't want to be alone. Only these fires did not look alive. They were too steady,
No licking tongues, no blue at the base. They were cairns of unchanged light, as if someone had set embers into the world and left them to burn without wanting to be warmed. The pinpricks ebbed when I blinked. When I looked again, they were fewer. When I shone my beam toward the ridge, they did not respond. No smoke rose, and the smell of cedar night pressed down simple and clean. The clearing felt like the back of a throat. I left, because leaving was an action. The ladder up to the tower felt longer that night. At the top, I locked the door, though the hinges were old and the lock felt anemic against the wind. The lantern was a ritual. Check the wick, check the glasas, set it where it could be grabbed like an old friend. I taped the journal into the top of my boot, near the tongue. Ridiculous superstition wrapped in practicality. The words, "Do not show your terror," pressed into my calf as I climbed into bed. I told myself I would be brave. Brave is a word easy to wield when the cost is not immediate. I thought of Claire and Ethan, their faces the way they were when we'd packed the kids' lunch one morning. Small hands, big smiles. I thought of the number on the bank's notice that had me breathe through my teeth and make plans of austerity. I thought of the ledger's pay line, tall and near enough to tide them through. Each of these was a small, clean truth I could hold to.
The first night, the sounds began as distant things, branches clicking like teeth, the soft sigh of wind through the pines, a high keening that might have been the river. Then there was laughter. It started quiet, as if someone 2 or 3 houses over had found something funny. My skin prickled. Laughter in the night is always wrong, either joy or mockery, depending on who was listening. The laugh was too high and too many pitched to belong to a man. It had a shape like small bones being shaken in a cup. It scattered my sleep like glass. I reached for the lantern and found the wicks soaked through. The oil was there, nicely present, but the flame would not catch. I relit it anyway. A thin, stubborn orange borrowed from the match appeared and held for a moment, then sputtered as if it had been declared insolent. The wick sizzled like a tooth in cold water and went out. The glass was cool when I lifted it. I walked the perimeter. The watcher night had a way of making the world thick. The glass windows blurred in the cold breath that was not mine. I could hear something outside, shifts of weight along the porch, contact where there should be none. A small tapping, repeated and patient, like someone testing the grain of wood to see how hollow the world was. I put both hands on the door and felt it as if I could listen through my palms. There was a rhythm to the tapping. Then something else, a voice close enough to be right outside the window, flat and mocking. "You left," it said, and the words had a familiarity like a man speaking the name of a place he'd been once. The voice did not sound like any neighbor. It had the bareness of something imitating speech. I pressed my face to the glass and looked out into the night. The trees were black, and the small lights on the ridge were gone. The world beyond the tower had a thickness I could not see through, like light passing through old skin. I could not tell if something moved because the dark moved with it. The journal's admonition was a weight in my pocket. Do not show your terror. It sounded like an instruction for a monster at a masquerade. I can tell you now, months later, that when a thing wants you to be afraid, it will work like an accountant with your past, adding up every omission and every failing until the ledger is all you are. That first night, they counted my mistakes like change. But counting is an art. It requires numbers. Stories do not need numbers to be mean. I remember standing at the window and thinking of Tom. Tom had been a friend since we shared a wobbly fort by the river when we were 12. He had a laugh like a bell and a mouth that refused to keep bad news inside. He took risks for the same reasons boys do, because the risk was a muscle he needed to test. He had been the one who first taught me how to climb an old radio tower without thinking the whole time about whether the earth would catch us at the end.
He left town the summer after high school and came back once, thinner somehow, like the boy had been stretched. I hadn't seen him in years. Work, kids, the way life makes ghosts of the past. Then he called me the week before I left to tell me he'd be in the area. I'd been thinking about him when the laughter began. The voice outside the window molded itself into Tom's laugh. For a heartbeat, the world made sense in the worst way. The prankster friend coming back to lean against the glass and tell me a terrible joke. I swung the window open, but there was no one on the porch. Then the porch light, my little utility bulb, flickered and went out like a candle snubbed by a careless thumb. The sound at the door intensified, the tapping becoming something heavier, a thud that made the ladder under my palm vibrate. The voice called my name. Not Tom's name exactly. It wasn't human enough to remember how I said it. It used my voice the way an actor uses a script. I banged on the glass until my knuckles blistered. It was an animal reaction. Make as much noise as possible. I shouted a name Tom used to have, and the world responded with laughter, like a chorus escalating. It was outside my door, then on the roof, then under the floor. The tower vibrated with sound that was not wind. I could have sat there and cursed and measured my options in the clinical way the part of me trained in problem-solving prefers. Instead, I did the least eloquent thing man-shaped fear makes us do. I looked for any light. My phone screen bleached in my hand like a child's toy. The flashlight I'd bought for emergencies, the heavy one with the damp smell of plastic, felt slick and warm, like a heart. I turned it on, and the beam cut into the night. For a moment, it was a line of comfort. Then the beam went dead. The battery was full when I had checked it. The battery meter read full. The beam still died. That's the precise moment I knew how thin the rules were. Not in the sense that cautionary lists are meaningless, but in the sense that a rule is only useful when the thing it intends to control obeys simple physics. The rules only apply after sunset, Cedar had said. I had not understood how literal he was claiming to be. Sunsets were not mere color changes on the horizon. They were switches. I heard something move behind me in the small room. No, not behind me. Inside me. The kind of movement that feels like memory stirring. The laugh shaped itself again, then cracked into a series of whispers that sounded like children trading secrets behind a door. The whispers were in the room with me, even though I had shut the windows and strung the chain across the door. I pressed my back to the cracked window and felt a coldness, as if the night itself had leaned into the glass. When the flashlight died, it didn't go out like a bulb that simply blinked. It sucked.
Light thinned as if it were being inhaled, the way a candle flame surges when you blow out, but in reverse. The glow pulled into something unseen. The glass warmed under my hand. The wood of the tower creaked as if under load. I dove for the journal because it was a thing of paper and ink, and people have an instinct to clutch things with histories when the present loses its bearings. The first page I found had 3 words written large and angry across it. Do not show your terror. The laugh came right after, shaped like a broken memory. You left, it whispered. You always left. My throat closed. Claire's face flashed, the way she frowned when she packed lunches at 6 in the morning, the small dark line between her brows when she thought about money, Ethan's small fist holding a tiny toy, the ledger's number, my father's voice, in memory, asking me to stay. The list of all the times I'd chosen something small and immediate over something long and steady, pressed down on my chest. The Watchers have a way of finding the fissures in a man. They reconstruct you from your failures. The voice was not a single speaker anymore. It was a chorus that slid into every syllable, a dozen registers speaking the same accusation. They called me various names. They called me coward. They called me thief. They said I'd left my family in the dark. They rolled their supposed sins in their mouths and spat them back in the shape of laughter. I did not want to be that man in front of them anymore. I didn't want to be the ledger of mistakes they could flip through like pages. I thought of the journal's instruction and felt it like a cold hand. Do not show your terror. My hands shook anyway. I could hear it, shaking like a sieve. I closed my eyes and counted backwards from a number I didn't know how to keep. It's a cheap trick. It works sometimes. It did not work in that place. The chorus started to match my breath, to match the rhythm of my heartbeat, to make the night seem like a thing that had learned the language of me. Then a different sound began, low and stubborn, metal on metal. The poker from the fireplace had been leaning against the hearth. I'd meant to use it to stir coals at dawn. Now it sounded like a metronome, keeping a tempo I could use. I took it like a man taking a tool. It felt solid and honest. It was not a charm, not a talisman, but it was something I could hold and let the world know I had not abandoned the axis of my own body. I stood by the window with the poker. The door thudded as if someone pressing their body against it wanted to be let inside. The chain strained. The house shuddered as if weighed by a person leaning their shoulder into the wood. The laughter rose and fell, and inside it I could hear, briefly, Tom's voice, pulled thin and wrong. You always go, the mimic said. You leave the small ones. You go to keep the big thing. I shouted, because shouting is an equation you can balance later.
I'm here, I said, because a man needs to give the world a fact it can measure. The voice answered with a sentence stitched from memory. But you were not here when it mattered.
I hit the glass with the poker until it trembled. The sound was a punctuation. The mimic mimicked me and added a kindness and a cruelty to the mimicry. I stayed, it said. I watched. There are moments when reason hands you the practical answers to a problem. Call dispatch, signal the ranger, drive down to town. All of those are options that make sense until the thing making the rules decides it needs different measures. My radio carried no sound beyond the static that had always woven itself into the frequencies up there. My phone's bar foolishly showed full signal until I tried to call and found the voice service was another candle blown out. I could have barricaded the door further. I could have climbed the ladder and slept like an animal up in a tree. Instead, I did what men in stories do that sometimes works. I spoke aloud the truth that had long been inside me, the one that the watchers had been rolling and tasting like a morsel. I left them, I said. I left Claire when I could have stayed. I chose this over 100 small things. I didn't want... My voice broke and the sentence unraveled. They amplified it. Voices became a choir singing my private litany back at me. It was a thing that hurt to hear. It was also a useful pain because confession has a way of rearranging the room. The notes in the journal were not spiritual exercises. They were instructions for how to offer the watchers what they wanted or to refuse them. The rule that had been scrawled was clearer now. Do not show your terror, not because blindness protects you, but because terror is a limb that the watchers use to pull you apart. So I tried the opposite. I tried to offer them something raw and unvarnished, not the practiced, glossy apology you give in public, but a cataloging of embarrassments and wrong turns done in a voice that had no ownership of performance. I said the things out loud. I told them where I'd failed. I told them about the week I let bills drown out a small, promising conversation. I told them about the times I'd been brittle and small. I said the apologies I had never said and the admissions I had swallowed. It wasn't a confession in the way a pulpit demands. It was practical. The watchers paused. Sounds outside, like a gathered crowd, shifted as if listening. When you confess to something, the shape of the thing changes. You put it into the air where it has to stand naked. The watchers' voices dropped half a register, like a radio switching channels. For a moment, the mimicry stopped trying to be me. That breathing space was not an answer. It was an opening. I took the poker in both hands and pushed back against the door chain with the one practical defense I had.
I turned the lantern's little wheel, emptied oil where it looked like I could trust it, and struck a match. The small flame awoke like a sentient thing. It was not large, but it was stubborn. For a moment, as absurd as it sounds, light felt like a decision you could make, and not a thing that happened to you. The watchers recoiled in a way that had the exact physiology of surprise. The dark retreated from the flame as if the flame had teeth. For a sliver of time, the laughter lost its edge, the mimicked voices stuttering into static. They did not flee, rather they gathered into a pressure, a shape at the threshold of sight, like smoke being pressed into a form. The poker felt hot in my fingers. I do not remember how long that pause lasted. It could have been minutes. It could have been the 10 seconds that make a difference. In that fragile interval, I remembered another rule in the journal. The light is not only light. Make your light hate you. Do not be a frightened lamp. The phrase is nonsense in the flattest sense, but sense and survival are cousins that do not always share the same inheritance. I think what the author meant was, make your light a weapon and not a plea. Do not ask the night to be gentle. Demand it be honest. So, with the poking tool balanced in both hands, a guttering match in the other, and the tower's frame trembling with the breath of many things, I stepped toward the door. Something moved in front of me then, a smear, like a man who had been painted with shadow and left in the rain. It took the shape of Tom just long enough for my brain to piece the face out of memory and fear. It walked not quite right. The shoulders were too narrow, the eyes too bright. It smiled like a trick question. Its mouth moved, and my name came out wrong. Jake, it said, and the voice had the cadence of everything I had ever used to excuse myself. You left. I struck the poker forward because the part of me that has listened to too many stories knows action is sometimes the right verb. The iron met resistance that felt like fabric, and the contact sparked in a way that was neither electrical nor purely physical. A popping, a smell like singed hair, a flash of light that was a thing apart from the match. The Tom shape dissolved like spray. The doorway filled with a sudden bitter wind that smelled of burned pine and cold pennies. The roar in my ears eased for the slimmest portion of a breath. Then the laughter returned, steadier now,
as if whatever we'd just done satisfied it only enough to demand more. The chain held. The door was still there. The poker was warm in my hands and had a smear of something that looked like ash. My palms were cut from gripping the metal. When the night finally receded a notch, not gone, but rearranged, I sat on the floor with my legs too heavy to move and listened to the tower breathe itself back to a sort of order. The journal was open, the pages ruffled by the fretful draft.
The line at the top of one page was written in a hurried hand and read, "Speak flat, show no pleading, turn fear into something that the light can swallow." I sat with that like a man learning a lesson through the slow mechanism of consequence. Dawn does not come quickly in the mountains. It arrives as a promise, as the horizon pulls the color from the world like a curtain. It humbled me by being inevitable. Morning washed the tower in a blue clarity that made everything else look small and recoverable. The clearing below had no trace of the altar's recent use, but the ash in the pit was still there, as if the night had left a sentence behind. I packed my bag with hands that felt ancient. The ledgers still listed nights and observations in the tiny, merciless handwriting of bureaucracy, but beside it, in scribbled ink, I added one line that would not have fit into the day's official log. The rules only apply after sunset. I climbed down the ladder slower than I should have. Cedar met me on the path, not surprised to see me at dawn, as if he'd always known I would come down, and he had the waste of his cigarette hanging from his lower lip like a punctuation. He squinted up at the tower and at the changes in me written like a weather map across my face. "You read the book?" he asked. I nodded. I handed him the scrap of caper the neighbor had left him all those years ago, the one that said simply, "Do not stray at dusk." Cedar took it and folded it like a man who folds things to keep them from opening. "You did right," he said. "Light scares them. Sound makes them curious. Reward them and they'll come back. You did not show them your terror." His words were a salve and a knife at the same time. I fought," I said. The sentence felt like a small confession I'd spit into a tin cup. Cedar shrugged the way men who have watched ruins shrug. "Sometimes you fight. Sometimes you last. Night tests who you are. It's not simple. Take this," he said, pressing another scrap into my hand. This one was bolder, larger letters, and the ink had bled. It read, "When they mimic, hand them your truth without show, then light." I slid the paper into my pocket next to the journal. I wanted to be gone, to race down to the valley and drive back into civilization where phones worked and people were gently terrible and normal. But the view up there had braided me into itself. The ridge had a kind of claim, like a place that offers you an impossible perspective on your life, and then refuses to let you unsee it. The tower had shown me a thing about myself, that under pressure I would be cataloged for my failings, and that the thing outside had hands that wanted to rearrange my memories into punishments. On the drive down the switchback, the landscape looked like a watercolor that had been set to dry in the sun. The ridges were clean and ordered. I called Claire as the road straightened into highway, and listened to her voice fill the car like warm light.
Ethan was small and impatient in the background. I lied and said the job was fine. I said I needed the money, and I meant it, and I hid everything else. That night I did not sleep. I sat at the kitchen table and watched my son for longer than a good distance from the house might dictate. Claire asked me what was wrong. I told her I had taken the job because the numbers didn't make sense, and I didn't ask her to fix them. She looked at me like a woman who has always known the ledger of my choices and who had used her forgiveness like scaffolding for both of us. She did not ask for the details. She did not need to. Kindness is often a matter of leaving the other person with enough dignity to make their own confessions. I promised I would be careful and that I would be home on my nights off. But I already had a weakness, curiosity. It sat baked into me like a tooth. The journal sat in the bottom of a box in the back of my closet, under some spare socks. I read it again because the human appetite for pattern is relentless. The book had more than admonitions. It had little drawings, crude maps, circles around words. One page had the 7 rules written out, some of them exact, some of them implied. They were not commandments exactly. They were more like the notes a man leaves himself when the world is making a case against him. Rule 1, keep your light honest. Rule 2, do not accept their gifts. Rule 3, speak flat, no pleadings. Rule 4, do not show your terror.
Rule 5. Keep the door a door. Do not sleep with it open. Rule 6. Name your debt out loud. Don't let them name it for you. Rule 7. When dawn comes, step the way men step out from water. Those lines sat in my chest like a report. They were terrifying, because even if they were nonsense, they were actionable nonsense. They gave a man ways to move in a world that had seemed to suggest motion was impossible. I went back up 2 nights later. Not because I was brave, not because I loved the place. I went because the ledger still paid, and because you can tell yourself you're investigating for other people. Claire, Ethan, the Bills. But often the truth is uglier. I wanted to know whether the thing that had touched me at the tower had been an echo of something I had always carried. I wanted to know whether confession and light were actually things that had teeth, or whether they were a comforting placebo. When I climbed the ladder the second time, the day seemed more brittle than before. The sun threw itself at the rocks as if to make amends. I unpacked the journal and set the lantern carefully on the shelf where the glass would not rattle. I tied the poker with a strip of cloth and fastened it near the door. I read the rules out loud once, just to feel how the words landed in the air. The act of saying something does something to the world. It marks it. The next nights were patient tests. The watching animals returned. The pinpricks on the ridge returned and spread like a husk of small lights.
Notes appeared in the same places, under the threshold, folded into the crack of the floorboard. Each time I found one, the handwriting had shifted slightly. No two were the same, but the messages were variations of the same thing. It wants your story. Tell it yourself. I started leaving small things out, an empty tin can on the porch, an old shoe at the edge of the trail. The watchers took them or didn't take them, but the effrontery of leaving gifts for whatever watched felt like an experiment. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it did not. The polite way of the journal was that the watchers were predictable the way tides are, regular when understood, impossible when ignored. And then the night I had not planned for arrived. The battery in the radio went dead, despite being new. The lantern's glass clouded in a way it had never clouded before, like breath had been trapped inside. And then the night I had not planned for arrived. The battery in the radio went dead, despite being new. The lantern's glass clouded in a way it had never clouded before, like breath had been trapped inside. I remember standing in the dim ring of the cabin and feeling the air go thin, as if someone had put a hand over a mouth and squeezed. The static on the radio turned into a drone that sat under everything, like an insect. I checked the dials until my fingers hurt. The battery showed green. The little red light on the radio winked like it was playing at being alive. When I flipped the switch, the static stuttered, then smoothed into a whisper that wasn't human language. It was the sound of tape being unspooled and words caught in the spool. Then silence. The map of frequencies I had carried like a small talisman was suddenly an empty room. Outside, the night rearranged itself. The small pinpricks on the ridge came alive in a line that moved, like embers carried along a string. They were too regular to be wild campfires. They blinked and slid in a way that suggested somebody, something, was scanning the valley, testing the seams. The ravens gathered in a tight knot, and then, as if obeying a command, they melted into the trees. Their eyes caught the flashlight when I took it up. They seemed to store the beam like hoarded coin. The notes escalated from polite nudges to something more deliberate. One was pushed under the door that night, a scrap as thin as a fingernail, and it read, "Name your debt out loud. Don't let them name it for you." The handwriting was messy and small, as if the writer had been writing one-handed. It felt like an instruction and a threat both. My palms sweat even now thinking about how obvious the next step was and how little I wanted to admit it at the time. The journals, cedar scraps, the rumors, they had taught me that this thing wanted a story. It wanted the particular cut of my guilt. It wanted me to hand it up, neat and wrapped. That the watchers preferred the currency of fear made the advice ring like a warning bell.
Say the thing yourself before they can. Name your debt. If there is a trick to courage in the middle of a siege, it is this. You have to be more interested in the act than in the result. Waiting to see what will happen gives the things outside the advantage. So I spoke. I said the thin lines I had been carrying for years, the choices I had buried under rationalizations. I said them loud enough that the loft of the cabin held them like a confession box. I left, I told the dark. I left Claire when there was a chance to build steadiness, and I let work and excuses crowd out the easy things. I thought the ledger was a life. I thought balance was safety. I chose the temporary fix over the patient thing. They repeated it back, of course, but this time there was something in the mimicry that hesitated. The chorus stuttered on the part where I said the name of the town where my father had lived. It twisted my own syllables into something sour and spat them back, but for the first time the sound ran into the frame of the word and couldn't dissolve it entirely. When you speak your debt aloud, there's a physics to it. The thing you've wagered becomes a thing with borders. It sits in air instead of inside your chest. The watchers can still taste it, but the flavor is no longer a surprise. You put the meat on the table yourself. I had the journal's instruction like a chair behind me. Do not show your terror. Name your dead out loud. Make your light hate you. Once the voice was out of me, something that had been circling finally moved. Not a person, not a beast. A shape that had been making all the other noises condensed at the edge of the porch, like smoke compressed into an answer. It took the outline of a man, and then, cruelly, the particular angle of Tom's grin. For a moment I thought my heart would simply fold and stop. Tom's face was a thing I had learned to love in bits. Early boy bravado, late-night apologies that smelled like cigarettes, a loyalty that sometimes made him reckless. The figure at the door wore those memories like borrowed clothes, wrong at the seams. His laugh was Tom's, but every laugh is a mirror. What's reflected is always a little off. You always go, it said, in a voice that had his cadence but none of his warmth. It pushed on the door like a hand testing a joint. It was obscene and intimate, an enemy that knew your safest heart. The mimicry worked like a crowbar on memory, wedging it open to see the rot. For a moment the instinct to beg flared up like a live coal. Begging is a human reflex. We think if we make ourselves small enough, the predator will find us tolerable. I remembered the line, speak flat, no pleading. The journal's script was simple and unsentimental. I had read that page again and again, committing the cadence to my mouth like a pledge. So I chose the harder path. I spoke flat. I treated my words like inventory. I named the debts, then I named the facts. I took the job because of money, I said.
I didn't do it for adventure. I didn't do it for me. I did it for Claire and Ethan. I made choices I am not proud of, but I am here. I am not leaving again. The mimic, Tom, or whatever had Tom's face, paused. The pause was a small victory. The thing outside arranged its features into alien amusement and then into anger. They pressed the door. It wasn't just a knocking. The wood took hits that were not random. They were a pattern, a rhythm that matched the worst moments of my life and then amplified them. The chain of the door creaked under strain. My shoulders found the poker the way all bodies find the thing that will keep them aligned for the instant they need it. I had already made a decision, half instinct and half from the battered pages of the notebook. If the watchers fed on fear, then I would make fear pointless. If they wanted my terror, I would offer them other things, my facts, my anger, my stubbornness. If the light was a weapon, I would use it not to plead, but to drive them back. I rammed the poker into the door as they pressed. The contact was not something solid. It slid through and met resistance that felt like wet paper. When the poker entered the thing at the threshold, there was a noise like a string snapping, and then a smell of burned resin and cold metal. For a second, there was a flare of white that made my teeth ache. It wasn't enough. They regrouped. More voices came. The trees around the clearing shuddered, and the pinpricks on the ridge multiplied like a ripple. The watchers were not a single agent. They were a chorus that could change shape and a pressure that could invent limbs. The Tom shape walked through the doorway as if the threshold was a broken seam and stood in the room with me.
Where I should be, there were only reflections, shiny black wells that looked like they'd been polished with old fears. "You always say you'll be here," the mimic said. "You write your promises on paper, you fold them small." It used things I had said before as ammunition. My own sentences came back at me with new textures. I think that is how it worked sometimes. It harvested speech, the way a spider harvests insects and webbing. The more I had given away, by avoiding arguments, by not confronting, the more material it had to dress itself in. I did something then I hadn't expected to do. I laughed. It was not a good or pleasant laugh. It was the laugh of someone who has been pushed to the edge and found absurdity in the calculus of survival. "You think you know me?" I said. "You don't get to speak for my life. You don't get to fold my stories into your teeth." The mimic smiled like a thing with too many parts. It stretched its mouth into something that was meant to be kind but only ever managed cruelty. The room felt at once very small and vast. Light, the journal had told me, is not only light. Make your light hate you. Do not be a frightened lamp. So I made a choice that was ugly and necessary. I poured oil.
I unstringed the lantern, tipped the little reserve bottle into the basin, and let the petroleum make a promise. The smell of it was bright and guttural. I could feel the heat under my nails where the metal had bitten me. I struck a match, the way you struck a match when you intend to burn a bad map. The flame caught and did not die. It took as if it had been waiting for a reason to exist. For a heartbeat, it was a single, pure thing. The flame in my palm, the light in a dark room, a clean fact. The watchers recoiled. Darkness has no patience with a light that wants to hurt it. The tom shape reared as if surprised at pain, and then, very quickly, it pivoted into worse things. The mimicry broke into multiple voices, and that fracturing is the worst sound the watchers make. A chorus splitting into jagged, dissonant notes that all sound like the same mistake. That was when they went for the journal. They had not wanted paper because they wanted me afraid. They wanted me to lose my story. Hands, I think, made of shadow, reached and tried to snatch the book from where I had it tucked under my arm. The contact was cold as old stones, and the wood of the chair near the door groaned. I braced the poker, held the flame stead with the other hand, and I did what survivors do, something neither noble nor brave in the grand sense, but very practical. I shoved. I pushed the poker forward and let the end of the iron meet the thing at the threshold with everything I had. The contact was an explosion of detail, light, heat, sound. It was not fire like in a story. Fire doesn't feel like triumph. It feels like reckoning. The tom shape dissolved as if someone had erased a chalk drawing with their sleeve. The smoke smelled like burned resin and old pennies. A white light poured from the seam like milk from a cracked bowl, then snapped into nothing, like someone had flicked the brightness away. After the blow, there was a quiet that felt like the thing had been stung and was deciding whether stinging back was worth the trouble. The laughter thinned to a single high ring and then a chorus of uncertain murmurs. The door sagged in the frame under the strain of whatever had pressed against it. The chain had been pulled halfway loose. My hands were raw. My knuckles split along the metal. My breath came shallow. I remember thinking, in the absurd minutes that followed, of small things. Ethan's socks spilling out of the drawer in a heap. Claire's hands roughened from work. The ledger's numbers that had seemed, at one point, like a map to everything. Those small things were what the watchers wanted to turn into talismans of shame. That was their economy. They pushed again. This time it was not mimicry so much as a tide. The walls flexed inward as if the room had become a lung and they were inhaling. The jar of matches on the shelf slid and cracked under the pressure. The lantern shook in my hand, but its light held.
The trick now was not to panic. That was rule number 4, but to act. I made myself an instrument of small, deliberate violences. I banged the poker against the frame, hard, until the wood gave a note like a bell. The sound cut through the chorus and made something irritable stir in the dark. The watchers did not like honesty. They liked the private things, the unpolished, the undone. A bell is honest. It's not offering. It announces. Each time I struck something, it landed like a punctuation. I named the nights I'd missed. I named the apologies I'd swallowed. I named every omission. I said them flat. Then I struck again. It was not ritual, it was method. The watchers tasted the words and recoiled because they had expected me to fold them into the shapes they'd made. For a long, terrible span of time, the cabin was a battlefield of small things. A match that burned longer than it should have. A poker that hit a joint and made the thing there flinch. My voice naming debt and not begging. They tried to replicate Claire's voice and failed. They put the accent of my father's anger in their mouths and made it slur like a poorly tuned radio. They offered my son's laughter in the shape of something empty. Each mimicry was a bait. I refused it. And then the thing changed tactic. It stopped trying to make me small and started to bait me with hope. A soft voice, gentle and exact, spoke from where the Tom shape had been. It used words I'd never told anyone and said them as if it had been guarding them for me. "There's a way out," it said. "Come with us. You can go home and everything will be fine." Hope is a dangerous currency in a place that feeds on small things. The watchers knew patience. They would offer a sugar of ease if it meant you swallowed a dagger later. I felt for a moment the old ache of running towards something easier, a life with less friction. I thought of Claire sleeping in our bed, of Ethan's shoe on the hallway floor, of the sound of the kettle boiling in the morning, ordinaries that in daylight are magnificent. The voice arranged them into a promise. I made a different decision. I said sharply, "No." Then, because words alone felt fragile, I roared, as if the word would have weight given volume. I slammed the poker into the door. The sound split the mimic's phrase, turned it into fragments that didn't make sense when reassembled. I struck again and again. Each blow was a choice to refuse what I had been in the past. A man who left for convenience, who folded promises small enough to fit into pocket change. They came then in earnest. The ceiling bucked as if something heavy had landed on it. A shadow unstitched from the beam and slid toward the floor. It was a mass of things, twisted limbs of darkness that had the shape of hands and mouths and old regrets. They moved faster than I could follow, a smear of unnames. My light began to fail. The match's flame leaned like a tired head.
The lantern, the one I had drenched in oil and lit with a kind of reckless intention, was sputtering. I used a second match, then another. The matches were a finite resource, and that knowledge is sharp in a way that makes you sting. The watchers smelled weakness. They pressured the seam again and again until the door splintered. The chain let go with a little metallic sob. Cold air poured in like a river from a broken dam. The Tom shape stepped across the threshold, and when it looked at me, it had the face of the whole town's disappointments. For a long second, I thought it would speak my name and then swallow me with some clever promise. Instead, it smiled and made no sound. The journal flapped free from where it had been clutched under my arm. It landed on the floor, open to a page that had a note I'd only half deciphered. "When they come, don't let them see your hands shake. Let the light be an arm, not a warning." I picked it up with a hand that trembled like a frightened bird. The other hand took the poker. I wanted to be both blunt and precise. If fear was what fed them, then I would refuse the currency. If light was the way they retreated, I would not make my light a plea. I would make it demanding. There is a moment in such things where tools stop being objects and become statements. The poker was a piece of iron. The lantern was a small pressurized declaration that flame still had physics. I took both and did something I did not know if I could do. I pressed the iron into my chest, between collarbone and sternum, long enough for pain to be a truthful thing that my body could not fake. The act made the watching thing recoil as if it expected a different kind of offering. When the mimic tried to take advantage, to step closer, I struck the poker down into the floor, then pivoted and drove the flame forward like a lance. Light spilled in an arc, a white bloom that wasn't the friendly yellow of the old lantern, but hard and glaring. It seared the Tom shape with a clarity that made the mimic falter. For a breath, the thing looked genuinely surprised. Then it screamed, if you can call that sound a scream, like many voices all sued together. The room became a crucible. Shadows flared and uncured fragments of night scattered like ash. The watchers writhed and drew in, their edges ragged. I kept the light aimed. I kept speaking facts about myself as if I were reading a ledger aloud. You would be surprised how coherent shame sounds when it is declaimed like an inventory. Bills, missed birthdays, one forgotten promissory. Each spoken thing seemed to thin them out further, like drawing threads out of a web until it lost its catch. They tried to bargain with me.
They offered small joys, things I recognized, small and bright, hopes that smelled like sugar. I swung and threw light at each offer. Light makes bargains awkward. It reveals the glue that hides them. It made the offers look like what they were. Cheap, imitation pleasures meant to distract.
At some point in that long fight, minutes that stretched like hours, the iron in my hand bit something, and the contact made a noise that wasn't in my language. The effect was immediate and dramatic. A white flare, brighter than anything the matches alone could make, erupted from the point of contact. It wasn't flame that burned wood. It was a purity that lit the room like a surgeon's lamp. For one sharp instant, I saw the watchers as they were. Not solid creatures, but gathered absences, stitched together by hunger and habit, and the light made the stitches show. They retreated, but not with the smoothness of an animal fleeing. They dissolved like mist in a wind that was not rain. Fingers of dark tried to grasp at the edges of the light, then broke off into nothing. The tom shape collapsed into itself, and then was nothing more than a smear on the floor that the morning would later fail to account for. When it was over, the tower smelled of smoke and burnt oil and something older, like a book that had been left too close to a flame. My hands were scorched along the palms where they'd held metal that had become a conduit. The journal lay open at my feet, and its pages trembled in draught. Outside, the ridgeline was mercifully still. The pinpricks on the ridge had gone out. I did not sleep for hours. I sat on the floor and watched the trembling of dust in the beam of the lantern, thinking about simple things. I thought about Claire's hands and Ethan's laugh. I thought about the day I had driven up to the tower and the way the radio looked like it belonged to someone else's life. I thought about the ledger and how tight my plans had been, and how often tight plans come undone by the stubbornness of living. Dawn arrived in the mountains slowly and like an apology. It pushed color under the horizon and then let it fold into shapes. The first light was clean, like someone had dragged a cloth over the world and left a truth beneath. The tower that had looked like a tooth earlier in my stint now looked like a rib someone had struck and then left to rest. The clearing was empty of bodies and heavy with the evidence of a night. A splintered plank, the ash ring in the pit. A few items shifted as if by many hands. When I climbed down the ladder, the mountain air felt different. It had the honest cold that corrects hallucinations. Cedar was waiting at the bottom of the switchback as he always did at dawn, smoking something that made the air smell like cedar and disappointment. He didn't ask at first. He never asked more than he needed to. Men who have lived long in places that ask for small sacrifices learn the economy of questions. "You did it," he said when I reached him. Not a question, but a statement like weather. "I did," I answered. My voice had reduced to the kind of husk it gets after a long night. Cedar squinted up at the tower and then back at me. "You kept the rules," he said. "You kept your light an arm, not a pleading." We walked down the trail together. It felt good and terrible to move among people who did not know how you had been accused. Nobody could see in my skin the battles of the night. The town was the same small town that always was. A deli with a bell on the door, a hardware store that smelled like nails, the post office with its small gossip. People I had known since I was a boy tipped their hats and continued with their days. Normality is often a salve and a threat in equal measure. It heals by ignorance and by the quiet demand that you not make them upend their own placid narratives. I drove the old road back to the house, the memory of iron and flame still in my palms. Claire met me at the kitchen door, as if she had been standing there waiting for the sound of tires. Ethan ran into my arms and almost knocked me over with the small scale of his love. The normal things of the house smelled like rescue. Coffee, laundry, the small grease on the stove that says someone has been trying to welcome the day. She didn't ask me for details. She had never been the kind of person to demand the production of trauma like a ticket. She asked instead in the low, practical voice of people who care, "Are you okay?" I told her that I was. It was not entirely true. I was bruised and raw and had the ridiculous certainty that for the rest of my life I would sometimes look at a patch of darkness and expect a familiar voice. But I said I was okay because in the daylight words become things you can check with your hands, and I wanted to be a thing she could measure. The weeks after the tower passed in a shape that was neither smooth healing nor collapse. I slept poorly. I flinched at small sounds. Once at a late hour I woke and heard the laughter in the corner of the living room, and for a scant heart it sounded like Tom. I sat up and turned on the lamp. The room filled with golden light and the sound was gone, replaced by the even respiration of my sleeping child. I kept the journal in a box that sat on the top shelf of my closet. I reread it only occasionally, like you reopen a closed wound to make sure it has scarred. The rules remained with me. I practiced them in little ways. I spoke plainly at home about the money and what I would do to make it better. I let Claire know when I had taken an extra shift. I named the things I owed by saying them aloud and not letting some outside mimic prepare the menu for me. People asked about the tower in low and sparing ways. Neighbors, co-workers, the kind of small talk that becomes a bedside candle of normalcy. I would say the job had been hard, that it tested you, that the Riach has a way of showing you what you carry. Some believed it. Some suggested I might have been too tired. That was the thing about places that ask for secrets. Half of the world prefers the box labeled tired because boxes are manageable.
Once, in the late autumn, when the trees had given up their leaves like tithes and the sky was the color of a thrift store short, I drove back up to the tower. Not to stay the night. Cedar's paper and the journal had tuned me to the difference between curiosity and necessity, but to see it in daytime, to hold it by the daylight logic that held all things safe. The clearing below still had the ring of stones. The pit had old ash, but nothing fresh. The altar space had been visited by people, though. Whomever had come had left an errant coin, a child's ribbon, an old button. The world makes gestures in places like this. Humans add offerings to the architecture of meaning. The journal lay where I had left it the last time, and I thumbed its pages. In the margin of one page, the author had added a line I had not read before. When dawn comes, step the way men step out from water. I understood then that the rules were not only about survival. They were about the way a man walked after the water had taken him under. It is different to be alive. The Watchers did not just hunger for terror. They preferred the foods of our privatized confessions. They would not let the man keep the account he wrote in private. They wanted him to live under the version they had edited. I think about that night often. I think about how simple acts, naming a debt, keeping the light honest, refusing to beg, rearrange a room. The tower took something from me. It demanded that I reckon. It left scars that are invisible to most people, but that vibrate when there are storms or when a laughter is read wrong. There is an economy to these things. You learn to trade in truth and light, and to keep the ledger clear. You do not apologize for every breath. You apologize where apology is required. You refuse to let someone else speak for you. That is the distinction the journal demanded. If you're still with me, if this kind of true-feeling terror is the sort of thing that holds your attention, consider subscribing. I tell these stories because they feel like warnings, and because I think there's a community in not pretending we are unbothered. There are people who read the way a place like that reads a man. I don't want to keep these lessons to myself. I do not pretend the Watchers are gone forever. The Ridge is a place of listening. I know now that some nights will be different, that shade and sound will find their ways into cracks. But the rules, shameful, simple, practical, gave me a way to stand. They gave me a posture. When the night comes back, if it does, I will have a plan that is more than superstition. I will have practice, and the willingness to say the things that have no reason to be easy.
In the months that came, I changed shifts, arranged more steady work, and kept my eye on the ledger, not as a map of escape, but as a means to tender the small things that matter. A dentist appointment for Ethan, a coat for Claire, a plan to not let the money decisions be the only language between us. I did not stop thinking about the tower. It is part of what I am now, the way a scar is part of your hand. Sometimes, late at night, when Claire sleeps and Ethan's breathing is a small country in the other room, I take the journal down and read a line or two. I read them like prayers or like recipes. Keep your light honest. Speak flat. Name your debt out loud. Do not show your terror. The last one sits heavy and impossible and necessary, and I understand more than I used to that it doesn't mean never being afraid. It means refusing to make terror your primary currency. If you have theories about what happened, or a place you think is less myth and more warning, leave a comment down below. Tell me where you'd hide if you were stuck in a tower like that, or what rule you would write for yourself. Share this with one friend who likes stories that sting a little. If you think this belongs on your channel of curiosities, subscribe. I tell the truth of the nights as best I can. I still drive by the ridge sometimes. I look up at the tooth of the tower and tell myself small promises about being home, about speaking, about lighting things that are meant to illuminate, not to beg. The Watchers remain a possibility. They will always be a possibility. The rules only apply after sunset. Daylight buys you space, but it does not erase the ledger.
What it does is let you practice, by day, how you will meet the night. And that, in its own blunt way, makes the difference between being prey and being someone who has chosen to stand.